In FNaF Help Wanted, we get a mention of an indie game developer that created a couple of games that tarnished the Fazbear brand, with a bunch of crazy stories about it. In response to that, Fazbear Entertainment sued the developer and decided to make a VR title to make fun of the games and the crazy stories. But it's revealed in the tapes that Fazbear Entertainment was actually in contact with the developer. They were the ones that hired the developer to make the games and purposely tarnish the brand in an attempt to rebrand.
Fazbear Entertainment hired the game developer. Those indie games were designed to conceal and make light of what happened. This isn't just an attempt to rebrand. It's an elaborate cover-up, a campaign to discredit everything.
And with the release of the second Tales from the Pizzaplex book, we got a story called Help Wanted, a prequel to Help Wanted. The short story tells the story of the indie developer and how he was secretly hired by Fazbear's, and what happened to him after he made the games. So this video will cover the whole story and explain how it connects with the games. With the recent revival of Fazbear's, now known as Fazbear Entertainment LLC, they wanted to make Freddy and his friends popular again. But they wanted to try something different. They wanted to rebrand in a big way and make people start talking about Freddy again. So, they hatch a plan. The story starts with a man called Steve Snodgrass. Steve is a janitor working in a gas station for minimum wage. Steve, with his skill in digital art and design, had always thought he would be a game developer for a big company. But competition was fierce, and he had no luck finding a good job. His whole life, he's been working crappy job after crappy job. And here he was, in a gas station called Gas Up, cleaning toilets. After finishing his shift, he goes home. When he got home, he sits down on his computer and works on his recent project, Chip Off the Old Block, a family-friendly fetch quest-based game, featuring cartoony chipmunks. He'd been working on many family-friendly games, hoping a big company would be interested, but if they didn't, he would just release it himself, and hope it would finally help him leave his crappy job. But before going to sleep, he messages Amanda, a girl he's been talking to for over a month. The next day, Steve was cleaning the place as usual, until a strange man approached Steve. The man in question did not resemble the customers they usually got. "I'm sorry, can I help you?" "I think perhaps you can," the man said. He had a strong, chiseled features and a haircut that looked as expensive as his suit. That is, if you're Steve Snodgrass. "I am," Steve said. "Could you step outside with me for a moment?" The man asked. "I don't know about that, sir," Steve said. "I just started my shift, so I'm not due for a break yet. I don't want to get in trouble with my boss." "Well, if you will step outside with me, you may find yourself working for another boss, and for a great deal more money." He smiled. Steve was growing more confused by the moment. Was this man in the mafia? "I'm afraid I don't understand." "Perhaps this will help," the man said, handing Steve a business card. Steve looked down at the card and read, "Brock Edwards, Talent Acquisition, Fazbear Entertainment." Steve knew about Fazbear's and their old restaurants, and the many criminal allegations and rumors of paranormal activity. "Maybe I could step outside for just 1 minute," he said. "Very good, Mr. Snodgrass," Mr. Edwards said, following Steve out the back door. "You are familiar with Fazbear Entertainment?" Mr. Edwards asked. "Kind of," Steve said. "I mean, I went to the pizza place a couple of times as a kid, birthday parties and that kind of thing. And also, I know a little about the scandals." Unfortunately, that's what a lot of people know about Fazbear Entertainment, Mr. Edwards said. Over the past few years, there have been a number of individuals determined to smear our company's reputation by spreading terrible rumors. And of course, the public dines on that kind of filth. And so, as a result, Fazbear Entertainment is in need of some rebranding. Okay, but I still don't see what this has to do with me. You're a game designer, are you not? An aspiring one at that, I guess you could say. You sell yourself short, Mr. Snodgrass. You've posted 2 games online, and they were quite good. Thanks, Steve said. He wasn't sure how this guy had found out about his games. He wondered what else Brock Edwards knew about him. And so here's where you come in, Mr. Edwards said. In an effort to laugh off our detractors, Fazbear Entertainment wants to put out a line of video games based on the lies that have been spread about the company. Horror games. You mean like horror games based on what people say happened at the old pizza places? Steve said. The idea seemed distasteful at best, cruel at worst. Yes, Mr. Edwards said. They should be scary, but at the same time, they should poke fun at the ridiculousness of all these rumors and accusations. He put on a smile that looked calculated. We'd like you to develop a series of 4 games for us, Mr. Snodgrass. I think you'd find the compensation much more generous than what you're currently being paid for, mopping? Mr. Edwards tells Steve that they would fly him out in a remote location where he'd have everything he'd need to work on the game and everything he'd need to live comfortably. Steve felt conflicted. He could finally be the big-time game developer he wanted to be, but to poke fun of murders and tragedies made him feel queasy. Horror games, huh? That's right, Mr. Edwards said. They'd need to be based in the Fazbear Entertainment universe, but you'd have a lot of creative freedom within those bounds. Steve didn't like that he would move out of his apartment and leave Amanda. Something about all this felt off. He asks Mr. Edwards if he could just work here. Mr. Edwards would refuse, as the company can't risk leaks. I truly appreciate the offer, Mr. Edwards, but I just don't feel right about taking this job. The world's a scary enough place without adding more horror to it. I really want to concentrate on making family-friendly games. Mr. Edwards laughed for a longer time than was comfortable. Do you mean to tell me that you're going to walk away from this opportunity, go back inside that store, and pick up that mop? Yes, I do. But thank you for the offer. Later that night, after working some more on Chip Off the Old Block, Steve gets a message on his dating app. He opened the app and saw a message from a woman named Victoria. Who the heck was Victoria? He opened the message and read, "Hi, would you like to chat sometime?" Steve looked at Victoria's picture, and he saw the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen. He replied to the message. Victoria replied back. They chatted for a bit, and they decided to meet up at her house out in the country. Steve suddenly thought about Amanda. Amanda was a nice, caring person, and there seemed to be a real connection between them. But then again, they were in such an early stage of their relationship that he wasn't even sure it could be called a relationship yet, and they hadn't said they were exclusive. Amanda could be dating half a dozen other guys for all he knew. That weekend, Steve would arrive at Victoria's house. The house was strangely in a densely wooded area, and the house itself looked like it belonged to someone's grandmother, then a young woman. He rang the door of the house, but no one answered. He sees that the door is unlocked. He steps inside and sees an empty, barren home. The house may have been empty, but it was not silent. There was a soft but steady mechanical whirring sound. And then, so suddenly that it made Steve jump, a loud, high-pitched ringing that hurt his ears. Suddenly, the noise stopped and was replaced by a voice. "Steve? Victoria would come to Steve and help him up. "I'm so sorry, I must have not heard the door." Steve was instantly bestowed. "Hi," he said. He would give her the bouquet. "How beautiful, and thoughtful too. Thank you. I know I haven't done much with the place yet, but with the right touches, I think it'll be really cozy. And for our lunch, I thought we could have sort of a picnic on the floor. We can put down a blanket. And I have a bread and cheese and fruit and some good chocolate." Steve would agree. Before he could say anything else, there was a horrible, high-pitched electronic scream. He looked up in the direction of the sound and saw the red light flashing of the smoke alarm. It was strange. He could neither see nor smell smoke. He reached up to try to disable it, but lost his footing as the room began to spin faster and faster, like an out-of-control merry-go-round. Steve wakes up on a couch and sees the same house again, but this time it was actually filled out with furniture and other household items. Victoria would come in the room and tell Steve that he had a dizzy spell and passed out on the couch. Steve would ask Victoria if they were having that picnic date. Now Victoria looked confused. "A picnic on the floor? You mean like on our first date?" "Our first date? But isn't this—" Steve looked around the furnished room. "I'm sorry, I'm really confused." "It happens, honey. It happens," she said. "Sometimes you forget things. You have memory loss as a result of that car accident you had a few years ago." "I don't remember a car accident," Steve said. "He was a very careful driver." "Exactly. You took a bad hit on the head. Brain injury. Most of the time you're fine, but sometimes your memory just wipes temporarily. And then it's like you reset, and you're all good again." This was upsetting news. He wondered how many times Victoria had to tell it to him. The explanation was weird, but it also made sense. His sense of time was off. That explained everything. She would remind Steve that they were married for a while as well. Steve woke up on the bed. He would see two kids, a boy and a girl, telling him to wake up for pancakes. Steve didn't remember having kids. He doesn't even know their names. He would go down to the kitchen with the two kids and sees that Victoria was making pancakes. Victoria tells Abigail and Avery to sit down on the chairs to eat breakfast. Steve would repeat the names Abigail and Avery in his head to remember them. He continued to act as everything was normal and sat down as well to eat breakfast. It was a happy breakfast. The pancakes themselves were terrific and the bacon was crispy, the way he liked it. But the best part was sitting around the table as a family. The kids talking and laughing, he and Victoria sharing private smiles. This was what he had always wanted. Did it matter that he didn't remember how he had gotten it? Maybe it didn't. People were always saying to live in the moment, and that's what Steve was doing. You couldn't get hung up on your past if you couldn't remember it. After breakfast, Victoria would tell Steve that their house is being foreclosed on. Steve asked her if he had a job. Victoria tells him that he works in the gas up. "Oh," he said. He guessed he had forgotten how to clean toilets. But the job is not enough to support the cost of living. Steve tells Victoria that he's gonna start finding a well-paying job. Steve sees a car pulling up in the driveway, and outside stepped Mr. Edwards. Steve went out on the porch to talk to the man he still strangely remembered. Mr. Edwards would ask Steve if he changed his mind on the job offer. Steve asks if he can work here with his family. Mr. Edwards would agree. Steve's face broke out in a grin. Their house was saved. He didn't hesitate. "I'll take it," he said. That night, Steve hears a noise coming from downstairs. Thinking it was a burglar, he looks for his phone. He realizes that his phone hadn't worked for a while, so he takes a baseball bat and goes downstairs. He sees Abigail bumping into the coffee table repeatedly. He calls out her name. She stops and looks at her father, smiling. Steve tells her to go back to bed. She agrees and goes back. Steve realizes that none of the doors were properly closed or even had locks on them. Just to make sure his son was okay, Steve peeked into his room. Avery was asleep, safe and sound, sprawled out with one foot dangling over the side of the bed, like always. Suddenly, Victoria appeared behind him. She asks Steve what he's doing. He tells her what he saw. She responds by telling him that the kids sleepwalked sometimes, like Steve does, but Steve would also have night terrors when he sleepwalks. Then Steve and Victoria went back to their room. Steve couldn't sleep. He always felt watched and in danger. He would really pour himself into making the first Fazbear Entertainment game. He would also turn his attic into his office to work on the game in peace. He was still haunted by the nighttime visions and fears, but during the day he channeled all those feelings into the game he was creating. Those feelings of being unsafe all ended up on the screen in front of him. If Fazbear Entertainment wanted a scary game, the scary game was what they were going to have. Steve then went down his office attic for lunch. A voice on the radio that Victoria kept on during the day said, "Heavy thunder showers expected over the next 24 hours. Take shelter if possible, folks. Lightning is dangerous." Their plans of having a picnic outside was going to have to change to indoors. After the picnic, Steve and the kids decided to play hide and seek. Steve seeked while the kids hid. He easily found his son, but he couldn't find his daughter. He looked everywhere and felt really afraid that he couldn't find her. Then he remembered that she usually hid in the bedroom closet. He went into the bedroom, but hesitated before opening the closet door. Something inside him didn't want to open it. Maybe because it made him think of his night terrors, of the sounds in the house that he investigated with a feeling of dread. Not wanting to know what was causing them, but needing to know. Then suddenly, she jumped out of the closet yelling, "Boo!" Steve cried out for real and jumped backwards. His heart pounced in his chest. Even in the daylight, even when playing with his kids, the fear was creeping in. He was afraid of noises, sudden movements, even of his own little girl jumping out at him. He tells the kids that he's done playing, climbed the ladder, and started back in on the game. It was easy for Steve to create jump scares, because he'd just been on the receiving end of one himself. He knew the startled feeling, the cry of shock, the accelerated heartbeat, and then that wash of relief when you realize that it's just a game and you're really safe. Well, he knew all those things, except for the relief. Lately, he never felt like he was safe. Steve made a habit of watching TV and procrastinating going to bed because of the severe nightmares he had. Suddenly, he heard noises inside the walls, scurrying, scratching, and looking for a way out. He knew he wasn't dreaming. The surface of the wall began to pulse and throb, forming a large bubble on the surface. Then, with a wet splat, the bubble popped, like a zit, and an oily, black substance spattered across the room. He woke up his wife. "Victoria, wake up!" "What is it? Are the kids okay?" Victoria sat up, rubbing her eyes. Unable to find words, Steve pointed at the wall, which now had a gaping hole of which the black slime oozed. "What?" Victoria said. "Why do you want me to look at the wall?" "Don't you see it?" Steve said. The black slime was dripping from the hole onto the floor. Victoria shook his hand. "Honey, you're having a nightmare. Lie back down." "I'm not having a nightmare because I'm not asleep!" Steve yelped. He never raised his voice to his wife or his kids, but he was freaking out. "I know it feels that way because you're walking and talking," Victoria said, "but if you lie down and close your eyes, it'll all go away." Desperate to escape his terror, Steve let himself be coaxed into lying back down. He closed his eyes, feeling how tired he was, how much his body longed for rest, but the noises in the walls didn't stop. There would be no sleep for him tonight. The next day, DJ Dan, the music man, would tell the people on the radio that it was going to snow for a while. Steve would look out his home and sees that his house was covered with a thick sheet of snow. He was trapped in his own home. Steve would still hear the noises coming from the walls in the night. The ringing was getting worse too. The high-pitched sound was always in his head, day and night. After a couple of days stuck at home, Steve was almost done with the first game, so that was one down. Once he submitted all 4 games, he'd get a big payout from Fazbear Entertainment. Their financial worries would be over, and they could move somewhere else, somewhere safe, where they could be happy together. Nightmare fuel. He had heard that phrase used to describe a variety of scary images, creepy clowns and dolls especially. But what Steve was doing was using his nightmares as fuel to power his games. The strange noises and sights, the ongoing feeling of being watched and tracked, he poured all of it into the game. When Steve started working on the second game, he found several small cuts on both arms and his chest and belly. How did he get these injuries? He thought of how he plays Tickle Monster with his kids, but how would they have even caused these injuries? Of course, deep down he knew that the kids weren't the source of his injuries. The source of his wounds was the same as the source of the high-pitched ringing that was inside his head day and night. The things that are inside the walls. That night, Steve sees the wall start to pulsate again. The wall popped, and a giant head popped out. The creature's tongue shot out and poked Steve on the arm like a needle. Steve ran from the living room, and the hallways also started pulsating. Then a hole appeared, and out came a serpent head. It opened its mouth and vomited little snakes. Steve hated snakes. Steve ran away and reached his bedroom. He closed the door and pushed the chair against it. Victoria would wake up. Steve tries to tell her about the snakes, but she doesn't believe him, and says that he might need psychiatric help. She gently pushed Steve's head on the bed to make him sleep. Steve laid down, but he did not rest. Even though the house was quiet now, the high-pitched ringing in his head was deafening. The next day, Steve was on the edge. When he first started working on the games, climbing the ladder into the attic had felt like he was entering the darkness. The horrific world he was creating on the screen as he sat in the window attic was a stark contrast to the happiness and light radiated by his wife and children and the rest of the house. But now the darkness was spilling over into everything. The only time the high-pitched ringing in his head stopped was when he was working on the game. Or maybe it didn't stop, but the game was the only thing that distracted him from the sound. The hours fell away as Steve worked. He was on game number 3 now. It was now Valentine's Day. Steve was eating dinner with his family. He was now over halfway finished with the 4th game. "You're quiet tonight," Victoria said. "Sorry." Steve twirled some spaghetti around his fork. "I'm just having a hard time getting my head out of the game." "Is it going well?" she asked, reaching over to dab at Avery's orange face with a napkin. Steve nodded. No matter how unstable and terrified he was in his regular life, somehow his work on the game was really good. "Can we play them when they're ready?" Abigail asked. "You can play them when you're a little older," Steve said. "Right now they're too scary for you." "Sometimes I feel like they're too scary for me too." Abigail and Avery giggled. To them, the idea of a grown-up being scared was so unimaginable that it was funny. After the kids had bathed and gone to bed, Victoria and Steve cuddled on the couch with the radio playing softly in the background. Even with the volume lowered, Steve could hear DJ Dan's familiar voice saying, "Even more snow tonight, folks. It looks like we're going to have a white Valentine's Day. If we keep up at this rate, we might have a white St. Patrick's Day too." Steve apologizes to Victoria for not getting her a present for Valentine's. She tells him that it's okay. It's not like he can go out and buy something. They kept chatting for a bit until Victoria decides to go to sleep. She asks Steve if he's coming. Steve's stomach became a knot of tension at the thought of lying awake in bed and listening to the noises, waiting to see if something bursts out of the walls, waiting to see if the monsters just wanted to scare him or do him lasting, maybe lethal, harm. "I'll be along in a bit," he says. She tells him not to stay up all night and goes to the bedroom. Once Victoria was gone, it was like he had lost his safety net, and he was plunged into darkness. There was a scraping sound in the walls, like something with sharp claws was inside them. The ringing in his head became so loud it drowned out the music on the radio. He couldn't sit here and be alone. It was so much worse when he was alone. The only time he could bear to be alone was when he was working on the game. He was on the last game now. He just had to see it through. He should go to bed. Even though he knew he couldn't sleep, at least Victoria would be there beside him. As he walked down the hall, the walls pulsated, and the ceiling buckled, so it looked like the underside of a hammock. The wall cracked, and from the hole came a spider the size of a basketball, which dangled just above him from a tendril of web. The spider's abdomen split open, and out came lots of small spiders that dropped on Steve. He screamed, trying to squash the spiders. Then Victoria came in and asks Steve what's wrong. She tries to reach Steve, but he tells her to back away because of the spiders. Victoria was confused. She asks Steve to come to the bedroom. Steve, still slapping the spiders away, follows Victoria to the bedroom. She tells Steve that she can't see any spiders. Steve looks down and also sees that there are no spiders. He sat down on the edge of the bed. They were here. They were here. The ringing sound in his head was getting louder and louder, like an ambulance announcing the presence of an emergency. "This place, it's making me crazy," he said, on the verge of tears. He stood up. "I have to get out of here. I have to get out of here for a while, even if it's just going for a walk in the snow." "No," Victoria said. "It's too cold out there, and the snow's too deep. It's not safe." But Steve was already halfway down the hall. The ringing in his head was growing unbearably loud, like a smoke detector designed to wake up everybody in a burning house. A smoke detector. That was exactly what it sounded like. Steve looked at the smoke detector mounted on the ceiling in the living room. Something inside him said, if you disable the smoke alarm, the sound will stop. As the ringing in his head continued, he grabbed a poker from the fireplace and hit the smoke alarm with it until he knocked it down on the floor. He continued beating it with the poker, then jumped up and down on it several times for good measure until it was smashed into pieces. At first, there was silence. Silence and relief. Then Steve became aware that although it was finally silent inside his head, he was still surrounded by noise. There was a din of the ever-present DJ Dan on the radio, prattling on about the never-ending snowstorm. But there was another sound too. It was different than what he was used to hearing in the house. Though, it wasn't scraping or scuttling, but a variety of mechanical sounds. Wheels turning, gears grinding. It sounded like he was on the production floor of a small factory. The sounds weren't the only things that were different. The house looked different too. The furniture was the same, but there was strange tread marks on the floor. Hinged trapdoors were on the walls and ceiling in the exact same places where the creatures had jumped out at him. It was like being inside an amusement park's haunted house when the lights turned on. The whirring sound came towards Steve. He hid in the closet. Victoria calls out, calling for Steve, but Steve didn't hear her footsteps, but a constant motorized whirring sound. Steve poked out of the closet and saw a robot. It was all steel, with visible wires and circuits. The only part of it that faintly resembled a human being was its face, a mask of plastic with feminine features. The robot calls out Steve's name with Victoria's voice. Steve realizes that the robot was Victoria, or at least it was what he had been calling Victoria for the past few weeks, or months, or however long he'd been trapped here. Steve felt like he might be sick, but he couldn't let himself throw up. If he threw up, he would make a sound, which would ruin his hiding place. He thought of the games of hide-and-seek he had played with his children, full of fun and laughter, so different from the hiding he was doing now. Wait, the children. The children are in danger from this terrifying thing they thought that was their mother. I have to save them. Then Steve heard his kids call his name. Steve peeked out again from between the coats. What he saw made him shiver, as though the temperature in the room had just dropped 40 degrees. The children were robots too. Smaller ones, but also with plastic masked faces with wide robotic eyes and exposed mechanical parts. They moved jerkily around the room, looking behind the curtains and under tables, calling for their father. When Steve didn't respond, the robots started to sound and act more aggressive. Steve didn't know what to do. Then suddenly, DJ Dan came on the radio. Stay in and stay safe. Well, everyone except you, Steve. Steve shook his head as if to jar his brain awake. This was impossible. None of it could be happening. Steve, buddy, you need to come out, the familiar voice from the radio said. Your family is looking for you. Playtime's over, Steve. Victoria, Abigail, and Avery, they're all getting worried about you. You don't want to worry your beautiful wife and children, do you? Steve saw the three robots go in the kitchen. He could jump out now, go to his bedroom, and get his car keys. He didn't know how well he'd be able to drive in such deep snow, but it was his only shot, so he at least had to try. But when he got to the middle of the hallway, he heard the whirring noise. He then ran to the bathroom, hid in the tub, and closed the shower curtains. He was out of breath from exertion and terror. The thing that was Victoria called out his name again. Steve heard the robot enter the bathroom. Then suddenly, the robot tore the shower curtain from its rings. Steve thinks fast and shoves the robot as hard as he could. The robot lost his balance and fell back, so Steve runs and finally makes it to the bedroom. He hears his children call out. Since the door didn't have any locks, Steve shut the door and puts all of his weight on it. He grabbed a chair and shoves it under the doorknob in hopes of making the door harder to open. Steve heard the radio again. It was moved from the living room to his bedroom. Steve? Listen up, Steve. Steve, this is your buddy DJ Dan, the music man. I'm here to help you, Steve. You're not going to be able to keep holding that door, buddy. Your arms are already tired, aren't they? Steve didn't feel his arms being tired. He knew his strength was no match for the robot's steel. Still, he tried to hold on. Steve, the voice on the radio continued. Do you remember when you lived alone in your sad little apartment, working for minimum wage and trying unsuccessfully to get a game off the ground? Do you remember when dinner was microwaved burrito you ate alone, and how sometimes you'd be so lonely you'd go to the bodega and buy something random just so you could make chit-chat with the cashier? I remember, Steve said. How did the guy on the radio know so much about him? And why was the guy on the radio talking to him personally anyway? Was all this stuff real? Or had he just finally reached his breaking point? And now, think about how happy you've been since you came here, DJ Dan said in his soothing voice. No one has ever had a nicer, more beautiful wife than Victoria. And your adorable kids. You always wanted to be a dad. And it's great, isn't it? But it's not real, Steve said. His whole body was pressed against the door, but the robots were standing their ground, pushing from the other side. Sure it is, buddy. Everything you felt for your wife and kids, it was as real as it gets. You just have to give yourself permission to be happy. But the night terrors, the things in the house, those weren't real. Those were just there to inspire you while you worked on the game. Say the word, and they're gone. Let go of the door, Steve, and I promise what's on the other side won't come in. You need to stop fighting this and let yourself be happy. There were tears in Steve's eyes. He had the best moments of his life in this house, with his family, but he also had the worst terror and most horrifying experiences he ever witnessed. He felt like all the most important moments in his life had happened here, and yet he had been in this house only a few weeks. "And how do I let myself be happy?" he asked. His voice sounded small and weak. "It's as easy as pushing a button," DJ Dan's voice said. "If you let go of the door and walk over to the radio, you'll see a red button on the side. If you push that button, you'll have everything you've ever dreamed of. The perfect woman you always wanted. The perfect children you always wanted. And guess what? No more pushing mops or scrubbing toilets for you, buddy. Because you'll be one of the world's most successful video game developers." That's a lot of happiness for pushing one little button. Steve found himself holding the door less forcefully. "But it's not real," he said, even though he felt his resistance weakening. "Reality is what we make it, Steve," DJ then said. "Make your own reality, and make it beautiful. All you have to do is push the button." Steve thought back to his days of mop pushing and frustration and loneliness. He let go of the door, turned his back on it, and faced the radio. "You can do it, Steve," DJ Dan voiced urged him. "You can live a life of bliss. Isn't that a beautiful world? Bliss." Steve moved closer to the radio. He heard the creak as the bedroom door opened behind him. There was a red button. All he had to do was push, and the fantasy would become reality. It was such a beautiful fantasy. And what favors had reality ever done for him? Steve's hand shook as he reached out toward the radio. He pushed the button. The high-pitched ringing filled Steve's head, filled the room, and seemed to fill the whole world. Steve clapped his hand over his ears, but it did nothing to muffle the horrible cacophony. He fell to his knees as the room started to spin. And then, just as suddenly, everything was still. Steve used the nightstand to steady himself as he rose to his feet. He looked around the bedroom. Everything looked normal. And then he saw her. Victoria was standing in the doorway. Her blue-black hair was like a halo around her lovely face. She was wearing the same green dress she wore the first time they met, his favorite dress. He could say she was as beautiful as the day they met, but that would be a lie. She was even more beautiful. "Victoria." He breathed her name in a reverent whisper. "Sweetheart," she said, looking at him with love in her green-flecked brown eyes. She opened her arms to him. This time, Steve didn't hesitate. He went to her. He wrapped his arms around her and pressed his lips to hers. Bliss. That was the perfect word for what he was feeling. His bliss was so great that he barely felt the continuous stabbing in the vicinity of his heart. So now that we're done with Steve's story in Help Wanted, let's see what happened in the outside world with the info we have from the game, well, Help Wanted. To the outside world, Steve was just a random indie game developer that made games about the Fazbear restaurants and the rumors and accusations the company faced back in the day. Steve would make FNaF 1, FNaF 2, and FNaF 3. The fourth game was not completed. Fazbear Entertainment would publicly state that these games are completely absurd and not true at all. And they pretended to sue Steve so that he can stop making more games, and to stop suspicions of them ever working with him. Fazbear accomplished what they wanted. They made Freddy and his band popular again. They started to make money again. But unfortunately, Steve discovered that they were tricking him with illusion discs, so they got rid of him, and the fourth game was only half done. But that didn't matter now. They can finish the game themselves, so the next part of their rebranding plan is in motion. A VR game, poking fun of the 3.5 games. The VR title would be called The Freddy Fazbear Virtual Experience. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please like, please subscribe, all that jazz. And if you want me to cover more FNaF books in the future, just comment down below, so let me know. So yeah, see you on the flip side.